Hospitals, a place of healing, comfort, and hope. But what if I told you that some corridors hold secrets darker than the night? Tonight, we're diving into 4 chilling hospital horror stories that will leave you questioning reality. From a mysterious patient who vanished into thin air to ghostly apparitions haunting the ICU, these stories will keep you on the edge of your seat. Story 1. The Vanishing Patient. The psychiatric ward of St. Augustine's Hospital was always unsettling at night. The fluorescent lights flickered softly overhead, casting pale pools of light on the dull, sterile floors. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and something else, something stale, almost rotten, that seemed to linger in the corners where the janitors rarely reached. IT was past midnight, the quietest yet eeriest time in the hospital. Most of the patients were asleep, their soft snores blending with the occasional beeping of monitors and the rhythmic hum of the ventilation system. The rest of the hospital was quiet, too. Save for the faint murmur of voices from the nurse's station at the far end of the hall. Nurse Clara had worked the night shift in the psychiatric ward for 3 years, and though she'd heard the stories, the whispers from co-workers about strange occurrences on this floor, she had always chalked them up to overactive imaginations and the effects of exhaustion. But something about tonight felt different. She adjusted the strap of her clipboard and took a deep breath before heading down the dimly lit hallway. The doors to the patients' rooms were lined on either side, each one closed except for one, room 16. The door stood slightly ajar, the dark space beyond it yawning open like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. Clara frowned. She distinctly remembered closing that door during her last round. Shaking off the uneasy feeling crawling up her spine, she made her way toward the room. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, each step growing heavier with dread. As Clara reached for the door handle, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps soft, slow. Coming from behind her, she froze. The air around her suddenly felt colder, as if an invisible presence was breathing against her skin. She turned sharply, expecting to see one of her colleagues, but the hallway behind her was empty. Her pulse quickened. Perhaps it was just another nurse, making their rounds in a different part of the ward. Yes, that had to be it, taking a steadying breath. She pushed the door open fully and stepped inside room 16. The bed was empty, not just empty, pristine. The sheets were neatly tucked, the pillow fluffed, as if no one had been there at all. But that was impossible. She had checked in on this patient less than an hour ago. Mr. Peterson, elderly, frail, barely able to walk without assistance. He couldn't have left on his own. Clara backed out of the room, her throat dry. Something was wrong. She turned toward the nurse's station, ready to call security, when a sudden movement at the far end of the hallway caught her eye. A shadow, a figure, moving slowly, deliberately, toward the exit to MR. Peterson, Clara's stomach twisted into a knot. How was he walking on his own without thinking? She hurried after him, her footsteps quick and light against the cold floor. "Mr. Peterson," she called, her voice echoing. He didn't turn around. She quickened her pace. He was nearly at the end of the hall, moving faster than he should have been able to then, just as she was a few steps away. He disappeared, not around a corner, not into a room that he vanished. Right into the room, Clara skidded to a stop, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She blinked. The hallway was empty, and doors near where he had vanished. No possible way he could have gone anywhere. A prickling sensation crawled up the back of her neck. Did an No! This wasn't possible. She had seen him. Clara's hands trembled as she reached for the nearest wall, pressing her palm against the cold, unyielding surface. There was no hidden doorway, no trick of the light. Mr. Peterson had simply ceased to exist. Right in front of her, her breath hitched as a sudden chill wrapped around her, creeping into her bones like icy fingers. The fluorescent lights above flickered, buzzing with an almost angry intensity, before steadying again. Then a faint whisper broke the silence. "I'm still here." Clara whipped around, her heart hammering against her ribs. The hallway was empty, yet the voice had been close, too close. It had been right next to her ear that a sharp static crackled through the intercom system, causing Clara to flinch. The entire ward suddenly felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in, pressing the very air from her lungs. Something was terribly wrong. She stumbled back toward the nurse's station, her mind racing. She needed proof that she wasn't losing her grip on reality. Fumbling with the security console, she pulled up the hallway camera footage. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard before she played back the last 5 minutes. Her eyes widened. The screen showed her standing in the hallway, staring in the direction of Mr. Peterson. But there was no one else. No figure walking toward the exit. No sign of a patient disappearing into the wall. She rewound the footage again, her fingers shaking this time. She focused on room 16's camera feed. The timestamp rolled back, showing an empty hospital bed. Then, at precisely 12:43 a.m., something changed. The bed covers shifted on their own before settling as if someone had just stood up. Then a faint shadow flickered near the doorway, barely visible against the dim light then. The door to room 16 opened on its own that Clara's breath caught in her throat. She quickly clicked through the rest of the footage. The shadowy figure reappeared in the hallway, moving toward where she had been standing just moments ago. But the most horrifying part, it wasn't Mr. Peterson. The shape was tall and gaunt, its limbs elongated unnaturally. Its face, if it had one, was obscured by the poor lighting, and just before the footage cut out in a static blur, the figure turned toward the camera and grinned. Clara pushed back from the monitor so fast that her chair nearly tipped over. Her pulse roared in her ears, drowning out all rational thought. She needed to leave. Now, forcing her legs to move, she grabbed her belongings and hurried toward the exit. She didn't care about protocol. She didn't care about how suspicious she looked. She just knew she couldn't spend another second in that ward. As she reached the elevator, a fellow nurse, Olivia, caught her by the arm. "Clara, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Clara let out a shaky breath. "Mr. Peterson? Did he get transferred? Discharged?" Olivia frowned. "Who?" "Mr. Peterson. Room 16. Olivia's expression shifted to something unreadable. "Clara, room 16 has been empty for weeks. Mr. Peterson died last month." A silence heavier than any Clara had ever known settled between them. She didn't ask any more questions. She didn't check the records. She simply handed in her resignation the next morning, and she never set foot in St. Augustine's Hospital again. Story 2. The Haunting of Room 304. St. Mary's Hospital had its fair share of unsettling stories, whispered in hushed tones during overnight shifts. But no room carried as much dread as Room 304. IT wasn't just a flickering overhead light, which maintenance had replaced multiple times with no success. Nor was it the inexplicable coldness that lingered, even in the height of summer when the air outside was sweltering. It was something deeper, something unseen, yet undeniably felt. For years. Staff had reported strange happenings in that room. Patients claimed to hear whispers in the dead of night. Some swore they felt someone watching them while they slept. Others refused to stay in the room altogether, demanding transfers after just one night. Dr. James Harris had heard the stories. He had rolled his eyes at every single one, a seasoned physician with over a decade in medicine. He had no patience for ghost stories. To him, every unexplained noise had a rational cause. Every shiver down the spine could be blamed on air conditioning. And every so-called apparition was a trick of the mind. When he was assigned to oversee a new patient in room 304, he didn't hesitate. The patient, Mr. Leonard Hayes, was a 76-year-old man recovering from pneumonia. A standard case, nothing out of the ordinary at least. That's what Dr. Harris thought. IT started on the first night. Dr. Harris had finished his evening rounds when he decided to check on Mr. Hayes before heading home. When he entered the room, he found the old man sitting up in bed, his frail hands gripping the blanket tightly. His eyes, wide and alert, were fixed on something beyond the foot of the bed. "Mr. Hayes?" Harris asked, stepping closer. The man didn't move. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. His breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling in quick, panicked bursts. Dr. Harris followed his gaze. But the foot of the bed was empty. What's wrong? He asked again finally. Mr. Hayes blinked, tearing his gaze away from whatever unseen force had captivated him. He looked up at Harris with hollow, terrified eyes. He's standing right there. The old man whispered. Harris felt a flicker of unease. Who? The man. The one who comes every night. Dr. Harris let out a slow sigh, his skepticism settling back into place. Mr. Hayes, there's no one here but you and me. The old man swallowed hard. You don't see him, but he sees you. A cold prickle ran down Harris's spine, but he pushed it aside. Delusions were common, especially in elderly patients recovering from illness. He adjusted the man's blanket. Try to get some rest, okay? I'll check on you in the morning. Hayes nodded weakly. But Harris could tell the man didn't believe him. Neither did the nurse on duty when he mentioned it in passing. She only glanced at him with wary eyes and muttered, "You might want to listen to the patients in that room, doctor." Harris didn't reply. He didn't believe in ghosts, but that belief was about to be tested. The sound was deep, ragged, almost wet. Like someone struggling to take their last breath, Dr. Harris froze just outside the doorway of room 304. The patient was asleep. The monitors showed normal vitals. But that breathing, it wasn't coming from the bed slowly. Harris stepped inside. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, sending goosebumps up his arms. The dim overhead light flickered violently before stabilizing. Casting eerie shadows against the walls, he scanned the room. Nothing, just Mr. Hayes, curled up under his blanket, mumbling incoherently in his sleep. The breathing sound stopped. Harris exhaled, shaking his head at himself. He had been awake for nearly 20 hours. It had to be exhaustion messing with his mind, but just as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. The chair in the far corner of the room. IT was positioned facing the bed, as if someone had been sitting there, watching. But the worst part, it was wet. Dark patches of moisture soaked the armrest in the seat, forming an eerie pattern, as if a drenched figure had just been sitting there. Harris stared at it for a long moment, his pulse hammering in his ears. Then Mr. Hayes stirred. Dr. Harris turned back, watching as the old man's face twisted in fear even in his sleep. He mumbled something, barely audible. Harris stepped closer. "What did you say?" The old man's lips barely moved, but the words sent a jolt of fear through Harris's chest. "Don't let him touch you." The next night, Harris returned. Part of him wanted to write it off as stress, exhaustion, or even the power of suggestion. But something about room 304 gnawed at him, an unease that refused to fade before heading home. He decided to check on Mr. Hayes again. As soon as he stepped inside, he stopped. The room was freezing, far colder than the rest of the hospital. His breath fogged slightly as he exhaled. Then he saw it. The bed, IT was drenched. Water seeped into the mattress, dripping onto the floor in steady plops. The sheets clung to Mr. Hayes' frail body, soaked through as if he had been submerged in a bathtub. Harris rushed to the bedside, checking the man's pulse. It was weak, but there. He was shivering violently, his skin pale and clammy, and then Harris noticed the handprints. Dozens of wet, inky black handprints streaked across the blankets and sheets, some large, others impossibly small. They trailed off the bed and led toward the window that was bolted shut till a thick lump formed in Harris's throat. Slowly, he turned his gaze upward to eye in the reflection of the glass. A shadow moved. IT was tall and thin, its form dripping with something dark and viscous, and it was standing right behind him. That a cold, clammy breath brushed the back of his neck. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was not human. It was distorted, wet, like the sound of something speaking through waterlogged lungs. Harris spun around. Nothing. The room was empty, save for the unconscious patient and the suffocating silence. But the wet footprints, they were now smeared across the floor, leading back to the chair in the corner. IT was occupied. A figure sat hunched, its form still dripping, its head slowly turning toward him, and then it grinned. Dr. Harris didn't remember running out of the room. All he knew was that by the time he reached the nurse's station, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely speak. The staff found Mr. Hayes unresponsive, hypothermic despite the hospital's controlled temperature. The old man was transferred to another ward immediately by morning. Room 304 was sealed off and no explanation was given. No staff spoke of it, and when Harris checked the records, he found something that made his blood run cold. Room 304 had been closed for over a decade. The only reason it had been reopened was due to overcrowding, the last patient assigned to it before Mr. Hayes. A man who drowned in his hospital bed. His cause of death was ruled a freak accident. Lungs filled with water, though there was no sign of submersion in his name. Leonard Hayes. Harris transferred to another hospital the next month, but sometimes, in his dreams, he still heard the voice, "You shouldn't be here." If you think that's unsettling, wait until you hear about the ghostly surgeon who refuses to retire. Story 3. The Phantom Surgeon. St. Augustine Medical Center had some of the most advanced surgical facilities in the state. Its operating rooms were pristine, gleaming steel instruments meticulously arranged, state-of-the-art technology humming softly in the background, but beneath the hospital's modern facade lay something much older that a story whispered among the staff. Some nurses spoke in hushed tones about a mysterious figure seen roaming the halls at night. A surgeon clad in outdated scrubs, his face obscured by an old-fashioned surgical mask. And no one knew where he came from, and no one ever saw him arrive, but some swore. They felt his presence during late-night procedures. Doctor Lisa Cartwright had heard these stories, of course, and she dismissed them like any rational person would. She was a woman of science, not superstition, but one night, during an emergency surgery, she would come to regret that skepticism, because that night, she was not alone in the operating room. IT was a little after midnight when the call came in that a young man had been rushed in after a car accident. Internal bleeding, fractured ribs, and a punctured lung. It was a life-or-death situation, and Lisa had been the attending surgeon on call. She scrubbed in quickly, joining her team in operating room 6, one of the hospital's older ORs, a relic from the 1950s that had been renovated but never fully updated. The surgery was intense, demanding Lisa's full concentration. The overhead lights cast a sterile glow over the room as she worked, her gloved hands moving with practiced precision. The nurses assisted in silence, handing her tools with seamless efficiency, and then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed that a man stood in the far corner of the OR. Half shrouded and shadowed, he was wearing surgical scrubs. But they weren't the standard issue ones. These were different. The fabric looked stiff, like something from an old medical drama. His face was obscured by a surgical mask, his cap pulled low over his forehead. Lisa barely spared him a glance at first, assuming he was another attending doctor. She was too focused on keeping the patient alive, but something gnawed at her. Something felt off. His presence was strange, silent, unmoving, observing. She stole another glance between sutures. He didn't move, didn't assist, just stood there, hands clasped behind his back, watching, and then she blinked, and he was gone, vanished. Elisa's grip on the scalpel faltered for just a second. She glanced at her team, but no one else seemed to notice anything unusual. The nurses continued their work as if nothing had happened. For the rest of the procedure, Lisa kept her head down, forcing herself to focus. By the time they stitched the patient up, she had almost convinced herself it was a trick of the light, a hallucination from exhaustion. But later that night, when she reviewed the security footage, her blood ran cold. There was no record of anyone standing in the corner. Lisa tried to shake off the unease, but sleep didn't come easy that night. The next evening, she returned to the OR, determined to prove to herself that she had imagined it. But as soon as she stepped inside, she felt it that a presence. The air was colder than usual. The bright white fluorescence seemed dimmer. The hum of machines and monitors felt distant, muffled, like she was walking into a place where time had slipped. And then the smell hit her, the sharp, coppery tang of blood. Lisa frowned, stepping toward the stainless steel counter where the surgical tools were kept. A scalpel lay there, separate from the others, but something was wrong. IT was stained. Dark streaks of dried blood coating the blade. That Lisa's pulse spiked. That scalpel hadn't been there earlier. It hadn't been used in any recent surgeries. And then the sound started. A humming, soft at first, and a gentle, rhythmic tune, lilting and familiar, like an old lullaby from decades past. Lisa turned sharply toward the sound. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision. She spun around. and froze. Standing just a few feet away was the same figure she had seen the night before, only this time he wasn't in the corner. He was right in front of her. The dim light cast eerie shadows across his body. His surgical scrubs were stained. Faint patches of dark red smears across the chest and sleeves and his face. Lisa's breath hitched. The man was wearing an old surgical mask, but through the thin, yellowed fabric, she could see the outline of a wide, grotesque grin and a twisted, unnatural smile. The humming continued, low and garbled. As if coming from beneath the mask, Lisa stepped back, her chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. The humming stopped. For a long moment there was silence. Then, in a raspy voice, the figure spoke. "Scalpel." The lights flickered violently, and in the span of a heartbeat, the figure was gone. Lisa left the OR that night with her hands still shaking. She didn't tell anyone what she saw, didn't review the security footage. She didn't want to know if the cameras had captured anything this time. But the next morning, curiosity got the best of her. She found one of the older nurses, Margaret, who had been working at St. Augustine for nearly 40 years. When Lisa hesitantly described what she had seen, the woman went pale. Then, in a hushed voice, Margaret told her about Dr. Alden decades ago. He had been one of the hospital's top surgeons. Brilliant, methodical, but obsessed with his work. So much so that he often operated alone, refusing assistance. One night, during a particularly grueling surgery, something went wrong. The patient died on the table. Dr. Alden refused to accept it. He kept cutting, kept working, desperate to fix a mistake that couldn't be undone. When the nurses finally intervened, they found him still at the operating table, his hands drenched in blood, mumbling a lullaby to himself as he stitched the already dead patient's wounds. He was found dead in the OR the next morning, heart attack, right there. In operating room 6, Lisa's stomach turned. The hospital had remodeled the space, updated the technology, changed the policies, but somehow he had never left that night. Lisa gathered her things and left the hospital without looking back. She transferred out of St. Augustine's the following week, and she never entered an operating room alone again. But sometimes, even years later, she swears she can still hear that old, haunting melody humming in the distance. Transition. Sometimes, the spirits of the hospital aren't doctors or patients, but something far older and more sinister. Let's move on to our final story. Would you like any changes or additional eerie elements? Story 4. The ICU Shadow. The ICU at St. Vincent's Hospital was a place unlike any other. There was no quiet in the intensive care unit. Machines beeped rhythmically, a cacophony of life support monitors, ventilators, and infusion pumps filling the air with an ever-present tension. Here, life and death waged their relentless war. Patients clung to the fragile thread of existence, their breaths shallow, their bodies still. Nurses and doctors moved with urgency, their faces etched with determination, and sometimes quiet despair. But it wasn't just the patients or the atmosphere that unnerved Jack, the young janitor on the night shift. IT was the way the ICU felt alive in a way that it shouldn't. The temperature seemed to drop as soon as he stepped into the unit. The air grew heavier, pressing down on him like an unseen weight. Some nights, the fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long, shifting shadows on the walls. Other times, the machinery seemed to malfunction in ways no technician could explain. Alarms blaring for patients whose monitors showed no irregularities. Jack wasn't one for ghost stories, but the ICU had a reputation. The other staff spoke of strange happenings, doors opening and closing on their own, objects moving, whispers heard in empty rooms. But what haunted Jack most was the feeling of being watched. IT started as a vague sensation, a tingle at the back of his neck, like eyes boring into him from the corners of the room. He tried to brush it off as paranoia, but the feeling grew stronger with each passing night, until one night, he could no longer ignore it. Jack was mopping the floor near bed 12, one of the isolation rooms at the far end of the ICU. The patient in bed 12 had been unconscious for weeks. A middle-aged man with a frail frame and a face so gaunt it barely seemed alive. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the monitors displaying his vitals in steady green lines. Jack worked quietly, humming a tune to himself to drown out the eerie silence, and then he saw it out of the corner of his eye. A shadow moved. IT darted across the hallway, quick and fleeting. Disappearing into the wall as if it had never been there, Jack froze, his grip tightening on the mop handle. His eyes darted toward the source of the movement, but the hallway was empty. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing unnaturally in the stillness. And answered. He shook his head, forcing a laugh. "Get a grip, Jack," he muttered under his breath. But as he turned back to his work, he noticed something strange. The patient's heart monitor, the steady green line, was spiking erratically. Jack leaned closer, his brow furrowing. The man's chest remained still, his breathing shallow and unchanged, but the monitor seemed to tell a different story. And then he heard it, a low, guttural growl. IT was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the machines. But it grew louder, reverberating through the vents overhead like an animal snarling deep in the bowels of the hospital. Jack stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. The lights above flickered violently, plunging the hallway into brief moments of darkness. When they steadied again, the growling stopped, but Jack wasn't alone. He felt it before he saw it, a chilling, icy grip that tightened around his shoulders. Jack gasped, spinning around to confront whoever, or whatever, was behind him. There was no one there, but as he turned back toward the isolation room, he caught it. A glimpse in the glass window separating him from bed 12, that a shadowy figure stood behind him, faint but unmistakable, its form tall and unnaturally thin. Its head was tilted at an odd angle, as if it were studying him. Jack whipped around again, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The room was empty, except for the sound of a whisper, so soft it was barely audible. "You're next." Jack's knees buckled as the words sank in. His head swiveled toward the monitor, which had flatlined, but the patient in bed 12. His eyes were open, staring directly at Jack. The man's lips twitched, forming the faintest hint of a smile, before his head lolled to the side. Lifeless once more, the shadow in the glass began to move, stretching and twisting unnaturally as it crept along the walls, inching closer to Jack, and then, just as suddenly as it began, it was gone. The light stopped flickering. The hallway fell silent, and Jack stood there, trembling, the mop still clutched in his hand. Jack didn't wait until the end of his shift. He threw the mop aside and bolted for the exit, his footsteps echoing loudly in the empty corridors. By the time he reached the parking lot, he was drenched in sweat, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He didn't bother clocking out, didn't bother collecting his things. He quit St. Vincent's the very next day, and the weeks that followed. Rumors began to spread among the staff. Some said Jack had been driven mad by what he'd seen. Others whispered that he had been marked, that the shadow he saw in the ICU had followed him home. But Jack didn't talk about that night, not to anyone, and yet the strange occurrences in the ICU didn't stop. Nurses reported feeling cold drafts that seemed to move with purpose, like an invisible presence circling the room. Doctors complained of seeing fleeting shadows just out of the corner of their vision, only to find nothing when they turned to look in bed 12. It remained unoccupied, and no matter how desperate the hospital became for space, no one would agree to place another patient there, because some things in the ICU couldn't be explained by science. And Jack knew deep down that the shadow wasn't gone. IT was still there, watching, waiting. If you love spine-chilling stories like these, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. We bring you the creepiest, most mind-bending tales that will keep you up at night. Like this video if you got chills, and drop a comment below. Have you ever experienced something paranormal? We'd love to hear your story. And if you're brave enough, share this video with a friend. If you dare, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, some stories aren't just stories. See you in the next one.